Everyone, today's mini lesson is going to focus on various founding documents that influenced the U.S. Constitution. Throughout this mini lesson, we're going to look at various primary documents and how they influenced the democratic ideas that were initially introduced in the Constitution. This mini lesson is not only going to introduce new primary documents, but it's also going to reflect back on some of the key democratic values we talked about in the last mini lesson, as well as some of the key ideas of early thinkers from the initial mini lesson on government-based philosophers. The learning target for this lesson is I can analyze the historical and philosophical origins of American constitutional democracy. It should be noted that the United States government is kind of a hodgepodge of different ideas that were generated both in the 13 colonies as well as in other government systems before the United States government was initially created. One of the most influential documents is called the Magna Carta, which was officially signed in England by King George III in 1215. So this would have been long before the 13 colonies were even settled. This document established rights, which is one of the first government documents to specifically spell out the rights of individuals and the natural rights of individuals. It also talks about limiting the power of the monarchy, so we start to see the introduction of this concept of limited power. Some of the most influential concepts that are established in this founding document are the concepts of equality and talking about people having individual rights and those individual rights being equal across the community, no matter who is in power, as well as justice. So we start to see a emphasis on making sure that there's a fair system in terms of the rights of the accused. The second founding document we're going to talk about is one that we talked about in the last mini lesson on democratic values. The Declaration of Independence was formally signed by the Founding Fathers in 1776 and declared the colonies independent from Great Britain. As stated in the last mini lesson, it should be noted that the Declaration of Independence was not a legal document, but rather was a document outlining the reasons that the colonists felt that they no longer wanted to be a part of Great Britain. It emphasizes the ideas of individual and natural rights, two concepts that the colonists, especially the Founding Fathers, felt that King George III was trying to take away. Some of the most influential aspects of the Declaration of Independence in terms of the Constitution include the emphasis on individual rights and talking about people having the right to representation in their government and talking about people having the right not to have to house soldiers in their houses and things like that, and this concept of democracy and all men created equal. The next document we're going to look at is the Articles of Confederation. The Articles of Confederation was the initial draft of the Constitution for the United States. It was officially signed in 1781 following the end of the Revolutionary War. However, it had a very short lifespan because it created an extremely weak government. The Articles of Confederation created a system where it created an alliance of 13 states rather than a strong central government. There was no president, there was no court system, there was no formal way for the federal government to collect taxes, there was no way for the federal government to force the states to send people to be a part of the Army and the Navy. Consequently, it gave an emphasis of power on the state governments and ultimately fell apart because there was no way to fix the Articles of Confederation because no one was agreeing and there really wasn't a strong system to make amendments to the document. And nothing was happening at the federal level. They had a very expensive war to pay for. They couldn't raise taxes in order to pay for that war. There was no way to defend themselves with an army and a navy. There was no ultimate person in charge because they didn't have a president. All of the ideas included in the Articles of Confederation were based off of the concerns that the Founding Fathers had with how powerful Great Britain had become, such as the emphasis on taxes and the emphasis on King George III becoming too powerful and not having representation. However, ultimately, they began to realize that even though they were concerned with how Great Britain had enforced those things, those are necessary for a successful government. Consequently, this helped to develop the federal system, which is in the Constitution to this day. The federal system is a balance of power between the federal government and the state government. There are certain powers that go to the federal government in Washington, D.C., whether that be the executive, the judicial, or the legislative branch, and some powers that go to the state government, whether that be the governor or the state courts or the state legislative branch. In addition to those major influences, we're going to look at some other aspects of other important documents. So, the Iroquois Confederacy was created by a group of 5 different Native American tribes before the United States was established. They came together to create a confederacy, which basically was a legally binding agreement between the different groups. As far as its influence on the Constitution, it is one of the first legal documents to develop a consensus-based decision-making process where people are voting to make choices. So we see that in the Constitution to this day in things like voting who representatives are and also making local choices on specific regulations. The English Bill of Rights was signed in 1687 as an extension of the Magna Carta, which I just talked about. Some of the major concepts and freedoms that were initially introduced in this Bill of Rights include the freedom of speech and a fair trial process. The English Bill of Rights helped to structure the Bill of Rights, which was the first 10 amendments or changes to the Constitution. Those amendments had initially been discussed at meetings for the Constitution, however, were later added as an additional part of that document. The Mayflower Compact was signed in 1620 by the Pilgrims who came to the United States. At the time, they landed in an area that they didn't intend to. And as they landed, they were discussing basically how things were going to be run. Consequently, they established a social contract for self governance where basically people were agreeing that a government was necessary in order to have a safe and productive society, which kind of branches back to some of those ideas that were initially introduced by several of the founding philosophers. Another one of the founding documents that largely influenced the Constitution was the Northwest Ordinance. The Northwest Ordinance was introduced in 1787 and looked at the process of adding additional states to the Union. This is a large part of the Constitution, which basically explains if a new state wants to join the Union, what the requirements are, and what the process looks like. It also establishes the idea that new states that are added to the Union are going to be treated equally to other states. So they have equal representation in terms of the Senate. They have a equal distribution of power in terms of the House of Representatives based off of their population. They are protected under the Constitution and the Bill of Rights and so on. The Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom was established in 1786 by Thomas Jefferson and largely laid the groundwork for the First Amendment, which outlines the freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of religion, and freedom to assemble. Montague's spirit of law was slightly referenced in the first mini lesson, but it emphasizes the idea of having a separation of power. So, within the U.S. Constitution, that is divided between the executive branch, which is the president, vice president, and the president's cabinet, the legislative branch, which includes the House of Representatives and the Senate, and the judicial branch, which includes the Supreme Court and the other federal court systems, as well as a system of checks and balances to ultimately make it so that no one person or one branch can become too powerful. Another influential document was a pamphlet called Common Sense. It was written by a huge supporter of the Constitution named Thomas Paine. Thomas Paine wrote this in 1776 following the Declaration of Independence. In this pamphlet, he basically took what the founding fathers were discussing about what they wanted the government to look like and concerns for the new country and put it in terms that everyday people would understand. He also knew that his audience, a lot of them were strong followers of religion. So while he wasn't a strong religious man, he made a lot of references to that in terms of the things that King George III was doing, he was considering not to be religiously sound. Within this pamphlet, he especially talks about the emphasis of self-government, which is talking about the right of the colonies to establish their own government and rule in their own way because they're so far away physically from Great Britain, and the right to revolution. So he talked about the right of when you don't like how the government's being run to basically overthrow that government and have the right to revolution. This largely gained support for the patriots under the Revolutionary War. Aristotle, we talked about in that first mini lesson, one of his biggest publications was called Politics. In this document, he emphasizes the importance of having a democratic and a constitutional government. So, this is where we see the concepts of voting and the idea of having a constitution to begin with. And finally, the last primary document we're going to look at is called the Federalist Papers. The Federalist Papers were a series of publications in newspapers that were written by Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay in order to gain support for the Constitution. A majority of the papers were written by Alexander Hamilton, who later would become the first Secretary of Treasury. However, some of the most influential ones were written by James Madison, who would later become president. Within these pamphlets, they defend the Constitution, and they also introduce an emphasis on a balance of power between the different branches and the right to individual rights. So, within these primary documents, we see some overlap, but we largely see the different concepts that ultimately created the Constitution as we see it in the world today. Throughout the remainder of the year, we will be looking at the Constitution and looking at the different responsibilities in the Constitution, how it's broken down into the First, Second, and Third Amendment in terms of the three branches of power, the separation of power between the states and the federal government, and the Bill of Rights. However, this is looking at the foundations of it.